All right. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Sean McConnell, and I oversee the professional education here at the Supply Chain and Logistics Institute at Georgia Tech. Today, as we go through the webinar, if you have questions that come to mind, feel free to type them in the Q&A chat box. At the end of Brian's presentation, then we will hear from him and we will address those questions. Today with us, we have Brian Wyatt. Brian is the managing director at NTT Data's supply chain consulting practice, bringing over 25 years of experience in transportation operations, strategic sourcing, data analytics, logistics planning, along with supply chain management. He's got a proven history of leading multi-million-dollar supply chain initiatives, optimizing logistics operation, and delivering significant cost savings for major clients. Throughout his career, Brian has held key leadership roles at the Home Depot, Georgia Pacific, and Chain Analytics, consistently driving performance improvements and operational excellence. He's also authored several papers on transportation optimization and has been an instructor at the Georgia Tech SCL for over 5 years. He was named in 2020 the Pro to Know by Supply and Demand Chain Executive Magazine. And Brian specializes in process engineering, transportation RFP execution, route optimization, asset maximization, transportation analytics, and cost reduction. So without further ado, I give you Brian Wyatt.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. You're going to join us over the next, say, 30 minutes, 45 minutes to talk about what really makes up this class. What are we going to talk about? What are we going to review over the 3 days that encompass the class? And what can you expect to walk away with when those 3 days are done? It's going to be really focused on transportation, but multiple modes of transportation. And so with that, I'm just going to dive right in. So, the things that are covered in this class, we're going to look at the different modes of transportation right away. We're going to look at, and I'm going to go into those details here in just a moment. We're going to talk about the components of port logistics, ocean logistics, and the ports, and the things that, how those operations run, and what are the things that drive efficiency and drive best in class performance. We're going to talk about best practices in transportation. We're going to spend a lot of time throughout this course doing that. We're going to do an exercise, and we'll talk about that some more in a moment as well. Application of practical cost analysis techniques. So how to understand how a fleet is priced, what are the economics that go into it, what are the things that drive that cost per load, as an example, right? And then how to get that cost per load down. What are the various elements so we can understand where the opportunities might lie. When we talk about ocean, really any type of transportation movement, Incoterms come into play. And we're going to spend time in the class talking about Incoterms. What are the various Incoterms? Which ones apply to really ocean only, and which are more broadly applicable? And what are the changes that happen each decade as the Incoterms are redefined? We're going to spend some time talking about greenhouse gas emissions, right? We're going to spend time talking about those mitigation strategies. This is always a big topic when I talk to executives about what is our carbon footprint? How do we get that? How do we measure it? And how do we reduce it? And we're going to talk about how transportation can have a major impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And then we're going to talk about a lot of the new tools out there that enable logistics. So we're going to talk about TMS systems and how those are used on a daily basis to execute different loads. We're also going to talk about AI and how AI plays in and is beginning to play an even larger piece of the logistics tool box today. And we're also going to demystify some of that too with AI, because there's, as you may or may not know, elements of AI have been around for a long time. We've just really remarketed it. So what are the things that we've remarketed, and what are the things that are truly emerging and that are new? We're going to talk about that throughout the course. So with that, let's talk about really what it encompasses each day. So in day one, and I'm going to show some examples here in a moment, we're going to go, like I said, right into that mode review. What are the different modes that make up transportation? We're going to dive deep into key metrics. talk about what are the key metrics that make up transportation, what are the things that we should be measuring to ensure that we are operating at peak efficiency and lowest cost. And then really what are the right levels within the organization that should be interested in these different metrics, right? Everybody can't measure everything. Everyone can be interested in every metric. We need to find a way to build that pyramid of that hierarchy of metrics and how those need to be applied throughout the business and who needs to be interested. Transportation accessorial charges. These are always those extra charges that are applied to transportation, stop charges. If you ever have an LTL charge or a truckload of pallet shipment sent to your house, and someone has to use a lift gate to offload that to your house, there is a charge for that. It's called lift gate charge. All right, pretty simple. But those are things that we need to understand those. And what is really the market rate for that, right? The carriers like to charge lots of different rates. So what's really a fair rate for that service? And we're going to talk about all those different accessorials and how they apply to different modes of transportation. We'll talk about the mileage calculations. There are different ones, and there are different ways to measure them. And we're going to talk about those because they're very important when you start talking about cost per mile rates, as an example. Federal and state weight limits is always one that we need to understand, because if we're working to maximize our every load and reduce the number of loads by getting as much on every truck, which should always be our number one goal in transportation, we need to understand what are our limits. We're pretty easy to understand the cubic area of a trailer. That's pretty static, or at least measurable. And that doesn't really necessarily have, other than the trailer being built, it doesn't have federal and state limits, as long as you're within the basic size. The weight limits, though, those do change by state, and they do change, and there are different rules that we need to apply and be aware of, and then how to apply them. Then we're going to talk about the market trends. What's going on in the market today, right? Are rates going up? Are they going down? Are we at the floor of this reduction in rates for North American transportation? We'll spend some time talking about that. And then we'll start our transportation procurement exercise. So there's a lot to cover in that first day, those 8 hours. And that procurement exercise will then bleed into day 2. So day 2, we'll finish that procurement exercise. Then we're going to go into a cost analysis exercise where we're going to dive deep into understanding what makes up the cost to run a dedicated fleet, and what is the cost to pay for the drivers, the technology, insurance, the assets, backup assets, implementation, all of those things to stand up a dedicated fleet. Once that's complete, we'll dive into TMS, the transportation management system, and what are the elements of transportation of a TMS, and who are the players in that, and what does it take to implement a TMS system in an organization. I mentioned Incoterms earlier, so that'll be something that we cover on day 2, and that will really conclude that between those 2 exercises for the day, that will conclude what we'll do. That'll conclude day 2. Then into day 3, we're going to dive even deeper into the private fleet and ownership management, route compliance, what are the tools we need to be using, GPS tracking, DOT, and so on. We'll talk then about port logistics. What are the operations? What does it take to run those operations efficiently, and as a shipper, stay within the requirements of those ports, and understand what are the different elements that can slow down our freight moving through a port, as an example, coming off of a vessel. I mentioned greenhouse gas emissions. We'll spend some time talking about that and the calculations to understand how to evaluate, based on a truck fleet, how much gas emission, how many pounds of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere per truck per year. And by removing a truck, how many pounds of carbon did we stop emitting and have a positive impact on the environment. And then lastly, we'll end with emerging techniques and technology in logistics. This is where we'll really dive into the AI element of transportation and how AI is impacting us and now and in the future. So just some examples. I'm going to spend the next few minutes just walking you through some of the slides and some of the content that's within the class. This isn't everything. That's just a fraction of it, but just to give everyone an idea. So again, these are all the different modes that we're going to cover. So we're going to get into truckload, LTL, expedited, parcel, air, rail, last mile. And I break out last mile because Parcel can be really B2B, say UPS, B2B. Last mile is that final mile, high touch to someone's home delivery that we want to talk about and understand, because it's such a big piece of our lives today. We'll talk about the different modes, what they make up of the U.S. Volume, and that breakdown. So we'll go a little bit deep into understanding really, why do we see so many trucks, and what is the mode that moves the most freight. Like I said, we're going to dive deep into over the road. So here we begin to just, as an example, we're just going to start chipping away. We're at each level. We're going to just continue to double click in each one, down to the point where for over the road, or FTL, full truckload, we'll talk about even the size of the equipment that's legal on the road, that doesn't have to be, it's within the federal guidelines, and is the typical size equipment that you would see, and what's the standard payload. We'll get into the pricing methodologies, the cost per mile, the round trips, backhaul rates. Why is it more expensive per mile on a short haul versus a long haul? Why is it my rate per mile go down, even though my total cost is higher? And explain that and walk through that together. Then we're going to talk about LTL, and we'll spend some time with LTL, just explaining what is a hub and spoke, how does that work, how is it different from truckload, and then we're going to also talk about what are the main factors affecting it and the tariffs. We'll talk about what's called ZAR Light, which is a very common tariff that's used for LTL today, and we're going to talk about how to calculate our density of a shipment, and then determine the class, so that we can then determine the rate using a tariff, and then how to do that calculation. So that will actually be an exercise that we'll do within the class as well. We'll spend time understanding how LTL freight works, and I don't have it listed here, but we'll also get into we'll talk about deficit pricing, which is LTL, which is a very common way of pricing LTL freight. So we're going to get really deep into LTL. We'll talk about expedite freight just a little bit. This is just an example of all the different trucks that come up in this section, that we talk about how the pricing is different per truck, and what you can expect when you hire an expedited truck to move your freight. Like I said, we'll talk about small parcel. What are the elements that make up small parcel? How do you break it down? Demystify how small parcel is priced, and then what are the limits? What can I ship parcel? So I understand when is this an applicable and the appropriate mode to use for my business. And often the line crosses small parcel to LTL, and then the other line will be LTL to truckload. Which mode do I choose based on the weight, dimensions, and handling requirements? And we'll talk a lot about that. Then we're going to dive into ocean container. This is a big one, obviously. This brings in a lot of freight into the United States, and we're going to talk about the things that impact it: congestion, the union impact as well, and so on. So sailing frequency. So we'll spend some time with ocean containers, and we'll talk about the different elements, the pieces that go into it. We won't dive into Incoterms just yet. This is really just to give an overview and understanding of what is ocean freight. We'll spend a little bit of time with air freight, not a ton, but we will go into it and talk about what is air freight, when is it necessary, what are the benefits. Obviously, cost is always a big element, and we'll talk a bit about that as well. Then we'll spend some time with rail. We're going to go deep into the rail elements of North America, and then talk a little bit about the history of the railroad, when it started, what are the big commodities that made up rail before, and what makes up rail today. And this is an example of the topics that we're going to talk about: stack train and bulk train. And here you can see bulk is coal, and that will be one of the topics that we talk about, these bulk materials that move throughout the U.S. We're going to talk about last mile services. So I mentioned that before, that parcel is part of it, but really you talk about three others, make up the four, which is courier, white glove, and LTL. And we're going to spend some time talking about this and dive into what is required, what's the difference between each, and how it is impacting us today, and how deliveries are made on what was commonly called Main Street, which is our home, the streets in our neighborhood. So once we conclude that, this again, and we're all still in day one, we're going to talk about the key metrics. So this is an example of all the different metrics we're going to dive into and talk about how they're calculated, when they're applicable, who should be measuring it, what group should be measuring it within the organization, and what level within the organization should be measuring it. For example, I wouldn't want an executive worrying about all my outstanding claims unless it was excessive. But they do need to be worried about FCOGS, which is freight as a percentage of cost of goods sold. So my inbound freight as a percentage of cost of goods sold. They want to understand that because that's ultimately impacting at the end of the day, begins to impact EBITDA. So once we've completed the exercise and the conversation around metrics, we'll dive into the accessorial charges and what are accessorial charges, when are they used, and go through a long list of them. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about accessorial charges because this is the fine print that often gets our freight rates out of alignment with our estimates and our budget if we're not watching accessorials very closely. Once we've done that, we're going to talk about the three different types of mile calculations: hub, practical, and short. What's the history behind each? How are they calculated? Which ones do shippers prefer? Which ones do carriers prefer? And which ones do we often compromise and land on? I mentioned weights and distribution. So we're going to talk this is a great little simple diagram that shows how you can ship 80,000 pounds GVW, but you also need to make sure that you're aware of where the weight is distributed within the trailer and over the different axles. So we'll spend some time talking about that and its importance and how it can impact a truck when it goes to the weigh station. So once we've done that, we'll take a time, and this is just an example. This is from 2017, but we're going to talk about some of the different how is the market trending now? Now that the demand is still light, rates have continued to go down, but there are different reports of have we hit the bottom yet? You've asked carriers, they will say yes. Yes, shippers, they say I hope not. Right, and so we're going to continue to talk about that. The market for transportation and where it stands today and where we think it's headed in the next 6 months. So once that's done, we're going to do we'll talk about transportation procurement. So we're going to talk about the different elements of procurement. What is an RFP? What does it look like? What does a proper addendum look like? Have we defined our accessorial charges that we talked about within the RFP? And then we're going to do an exercise. We're going to, once we've talked about all the different different elements of procurement, we're going to do this exercise. And I like to bring up this graphic because as we do the exercise, it's important to understand that these are the areas that get the most focus, is the bid management once the bid goes out and all the scenarios, what does the work look like. But we're going to spend time doing this preparation piece and understand the post impact, because this is where it really matters. Did I get my bid out with the correct number of lanes and the correct information to my carriers? And then when it came back out, does it reflect accurately what the carriers have committed to, and can I get it back into my TMS system? That's what's most important at the end of the day. So we'll spend time talking about that. We'll also spend some time setting expectations. What does an RFP look like? How much time does it take? And what are the different stages of that of those RFPs? As you can see here, it can be 14 to 20 weeks to do an RFP properly. That's from the very beginning of gathering data to ultimately finalizing contracts and having them uploaded into TMS. And we'll talk about all the different elements and how to get there. We'll also talk about, when we run our scenarios, is really where's the optimal price for our lanes, right? We got, whether it's soft costs, is this a carrier that requires a lot of administration by our team because they're high maintenance, but they're really low cost. So how would we rate that? How would we burden their rates offline with that impact? And so on. So we're going to talk a bit about where is really our optimal bid price, both from a soft cost and from a direct cost perspective. And then we'll talk about long-term procurement. What does that look like? What are the things we need to do? to have best-in-class procurement practices within our transportation department. And like I said, then we're going to do that mock RFP. We're going to dive in. We'll have fake data that I'll give you. It's going to go in and we'll figure out the number of lanes, the miles, and the characteristics of our fleet, and put that into a form that would go to carriers. And then I will give you input responses, basically fake responses from the carriers, and we'll evaluate 3 carriers and see which one is cheaper and where they give answers in different areas. Or in different responses in different, say, our fixed and variable categories, and how what most matters is our total cost, and walk through that analysis process together. So that's all day 1. So going into day 2, we'll finish that exercise at cost analysis of that RFP process in the morning, and then we'll dive in our cost analysis. And this is where we'll start to understand, where does it make sense to have our fleet. At some point, it's cheaper to have somebody else run our fleet if we've got 1 or 2 trucks, but at some point we become large enough. Where do we need to have our own fleet? And what does that cost? Where's that line? We'll do a deep dive into those cost elements of a private fleet. So this is just a quick graphic to kind of understand these are the elements that we have, different elements to understand before we go and do the analysis. So that exercise is, we're going to capture all these different elements that make up the fleet, and we're going to dive into each one of them to understand what goes into each of these buckets in terms of cost for a dedicated or private fleet. So once we've completed that, we're going to dive into TMS fundamentals. We'll spend a lot of time talking about TMS, because this is the system, the nervous system of a transportation team. Where is our freight? How is it routed? Are we tendering it to the right carriers? Are we meeting on-time performance? How are we managing exceptions every day, and how quickly can we manage them? So we'll talk about how TMS enables a lot of that, and what are the different systems that can be tied into or a part of the core. What's core functionality, and then what are bolt-ons to a TMS? And then we'll talk about a little bit of the history of the TMS systems out there today and how it has evolved. And then we're going to talk about TMS and MSP. And MSP is a managed service provider. And this is where someone comes in and really is a 3PL, but they bring the technology with them. And we'll talk about who is out there doing that, and is it cheaper, or what are the elements that help us decide, should we build it in-house, build a transportation team, or should we, which includes buying the software, or do we farm it out? Do we hire a 3PL to run our transportation team for us in operations? And then what would that take, and what would that likely cost? And then, so we'll talk about those 2 things as well, and who are the vendors. And this is just a small list. There's a lot of them out there. Then we'll talk about TMS. So if we decide to go the TMS route, what does that look like? What's the process to get there? And what are the phases? So once we've completed the technology TMS side of things, we're going to dive into the Incoterm fundamentals. And this is where we understand, what is an Incoterm? What does that mean? And why is it used today, and how it's used internationally for shipments? We'll go a bit into the history of Incoterms, and then talk about each of these different Incoterms and the ones, how they apply, where's the shipper responsible, where's the buyer responsible, consignee, and then where are they applicable to, say, domestic transportation, and where are they only applicable to sea. And this is an example of where the line begins to cross between seller and buyer's obligations. That's from 2010. I've got an updated graphic for that. So once we got that done, we'll dive into those port logistics that we talked about before, where is the majority of international freight coming in by ocean to the United States. And in this case, we'll talk a bit about the Panama Canal extension and expansion, and how what freight it impacted, and how, once they expanded it, the size of vessels they were able to bring in, and how that impacted volume onto the East Coast. An example of all the different shipping lanes throughout the world that we'll spend some time talking about. And you often can't talk about ocean without talking about rail a little bit more. And this is where we'll dive into the rail system and how they interact, especially on intermodal and stack trains from international freight. Talk a bit about different vessel types, watch a couple of videos on these different vessels and see what those look like when they're running. As I mentioned before, we'll talk about carbon emissions, understanding its impact today, and do a bit of an activity to understand the calculations that go into that. And then lastly, and then we're going to end on emerging technology, AI, and the changes within the network. So we're going to spend some time. You can't talk about that without talking about Amazon and their growth and how it's impacted our daily lives, as well as transportation as a whole. We start talking about their fleet, and you talk about their delivery trucks. And then we're going to talk about the physical internet. It's a really fascinating topic that's really big here at Supply Chain Logistics Institute in Georgia Tech. This is the use of standardizing the shipment of goods. So basically making these things more standard, like you would the digital internet, right? And dive into the concept and how that will impact transportation in the future, and how, for example, modular transportation containers that fit within a container could be used to speed up and enhance and standardize the movement of freight around the world. And once we've covered that for a bit, we're going to dive into the history of AI. What does that mean? Where did the term come from? And then how is it applicable today, and where is it used today? Route optimization, inventory planning, and more than just these couple of topics, but we'll spend time discussing that and understanding and demystifying that term AI and how it's used today. So at the end of the day, I'm sure the big question on everyone's mind is, what am I going to walk away with? I understood what we're going to cover. So for me, you're going to have the ability to answer strategic questions regarding transportation operations, right? As any transportation leader needs to be thinking, this is where their heads need to be thinking, right? What's my strategy, transformation? Are my processes benefiting the business? What metrics am I using, and am I using them properly and at the right level within the organization? You'll be able to answer the system selection. What TMS are we using? Do we have one today? Should we have a TMS, or should we hire an MSP, managed service provider, to run our transportation systems and routing? And then we'll talk. You'll be able to talk about mode and fleet analysis. Are there ways to reduce costs? Should I be using parcel instead of LTL, or vice versa? And the same, should I be using truckload, or should I be using LTL? And then lastly, you'll be able to talk intelligently about spend optimization. Are our contracts optimized? Do we have the right elements in our freight and transportation contracts? Do we have the right mix of carriers within our network? And are we at a point where if I look at our lanes and I compare them to the tools that are available today, should I go out to RFP with my freight? And if so, conduct an RFP. So with that, that concludes an overview of the class and the elements that will be contained within it. So with that, Sean, I'll hand it back to you if we've got any Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. That was very informative. So some of the questions that we have popping up are, what are some of the prerequisites that that this course might need, both in terms of formal education, but maybe just in terms of general skills that might set someone up for success in this class?
Great question. Yeah, we try to cater it to really everybody in the class. So varying levels. And having taught this for 5 years, I've had varying levels of experience within transportation. So this is a good class if you're just starting out and about to go into a transportation role, or want to understand transportation more. Great class for that. If you're the seasoned person within transportation or within operations and need to understand it at another level, this is also the class for you. We're going to dive deep into these topics. Now, as far as tools, really we leverage Excel a lot, or sheets within the class. So those are really in terms of tools, because I'm giving you templates, and a lot of them we'll walk through the math together, how to create the formulas if needed. So Excel, in terms of technology, is really the only technology that you need to be familiar with and able to leverage, and not even at expert level. I would say, be a little bit more than beginner. Close to intermediate would be preferable, but we can always walk you through. Again, I've had people at varying levels of expertise with Excel.
It's an excellent answer. We've got some general questions about the certificate series that this particular course falls within. So that is the supply chain management certificate. And so a lot of the courses that you would need to fulfill that particular certificate is obviously this principles of transportation management, also taking inventory management and resource allocation, oftentimes referred to as demand planning and inventory management. But then there's also some courses here that are asynchronous, self-paced online courses. And so this is one of the more flexible of our certificate offerings within the SCL here at Georgia Tech. So just wanted to highlight that as people seem to have some questions about the certificate series that this is positioned within. I know that seems to be the majority of our questions, and so want to give people a few minutes. I know it's a lot of information that Brian has put out, but obviously this is just kind of dipping your toe into the water so that you can understand about this class. If you're interested in registering for this class, we're going to send up a follow-up email that has the registration link. So you click the link, you sign up for the course. I do want to highlight that if you are a Georgia resident, there is a coupon code, thanks in large part to a generous grant, Georgia AIM, which Georgia residents can have this course 50% off. If you are trying to get that supply chain management certificate, there's a 17% discount. So obviously those are not stackable, but want to put those out if you are interested in this course and moving forward. Seeing as there are no more questions, I want to thank everyone for their time today. I want to thank you, Brian, for your expertise and your willingness to share this information with us. And we look to your class. So thank you, guys. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks all.